Hi, everyone. Welcome to I believe it's our final book chat of the season. So thank you, Donna and Nicholas, for uh, seeing us, oh gosh, to the coming state of affairs. So we're pleased to host our colleague from German, Nicholas Baer, to discuss his new book, Historical Turns, Weimar Cinema and the Crisis of Historicism. Today, Nicholas is joined by Donna Jones, a professor in the Department of English, colleague from the Department of English. Not insignificantly, Professor Jones is currently working on a manuscript with the title, The Ambiguous Promise of European Decline, Race and Historical Pessimism in the Era of the Great War. A quick look at my podcast this morning revealed a kind of or has made clear to me that we are in the midst of a historical turn. The titles give it away. Are we going to be okay? Where does this leave Democrats? Are we on the cusp of a new political order? The interrogative form reveals a bit of the uncertainty and even despair of this historical turn, and I can think of no other colleagues I'd rather hear address pessimism and the crisis of historical thinking than Nicholas and Donna. So we're eager to hear your conversation today. So I turn the mic over to you. Thanks.
Okay, I can go first. Yes, thank you, and yeah, hello. I'm actually in the midst of all of the madness of the last couple of days. I actually was looking forward to this event. So, there's an array of at least pleasure. But first, let me begin by saying it was an absolute pleasure reading The Historical Turn by Weimar Cinema and the Crisis of Historicism. Nick, I really enjoyed this immensely. First among the many pleasures, this study brings together in conversation many of my lifelong interests and obsessions, modernist aesthetics, expressionism, and whatnot. One not so secret interest, for those who know me, the kooky pessimist social theorists such as Oswald Spengler and Theodor Lessing, the author of Geschichte als Sinngebung des Sinnlosen, or as you've deftly translated, history as giving meaning to the meaningless. I mean, that's one of those under the radar kind of works, and I was actually really happy to see you incorporating that, and in particular incorporating that in the kind of the so-called Oriental imaginary of Weimar cinema. So that was really quite wonderful. Well, this work takes up, mobilizes, engages the complex and varied dimensions of the historicist right, beginning with Dilthey and extending to Weimar. I was equally as fascinated with Nick's careful dissection of the merits and limitations of what he refers to as the new film history, a canon that I'm not familiar with, but which this monograph brings to sharp relief through its juxtaposition with early 20th century philosophies of history. I would venture that Dilthey provides the crucial point of entry for this monograph. The crisis of historicism comes from, on the one hand, the historical discipline's overreach, right? Historicism imagines every pursuit, law, the state, morality, religion, as imminently historical and understandable through historical methods. It would be interesting to think about this in the context, say, of Jameson, always historicized, and where and how that framework of the historical, which in a sense, given our current predicament, kind of a lack of the historical memory, the lack of the historical in terms of how we frame the social, this continent. This also might be something we might think about. But in any case, the Dilthey does provide this structure, right? That so on the one hand, the overreach of the historical. And on the other hand, this criticism that he brings up, that the value of history comes from its challenge to transhistorical metaphysical systems. And that is to say that what he wants to reserve from history, as you nicely put out, is it brings in the coordinates of time, of the space. It's worldly, it keeps us here, right? So we want to maintain that, but it also banishes the kind of metaphysical. But the additional critique, and this is where I really liked where like the function and role of cinema, or at least I just kind of venture and push you in that direction of this, that, you know, the additional aspect of Dilthey's critique of naturally is to say that, you know, history doesn't sufficiently address inner experience, right? So this is a historicist dilemma, right? What about the status of inner experience? And we can also maybe discuss the kind of politics and political trajectory that inner experience takes. Certainly in Weimar, it took a wide range of political directions. But also if we're thinking future, like if we're thinking in the future and the present. But, you know, but film as addressing that dynamic, right, of inner experience. So I think that you wager that Weimar's cinema structurally, informally struggles with the limitations of historicism through their modes of aesthetic experimentation with space and spatiality, as in the case of Dr. Caligari, time, as in the case of Richter, or analogy in Lang's Metropolis. And so the limits of new film theory, that is that new film theory misplaces the historical in narrative cinema, spectacles like D.W. Griffith or Abel Gance, or cinematic realism, or the cinema of the everyday. I would also note that this is like, you know, if I would ask as well, it's like, is there a relationship with the kind of limitations or the limited scope of the historical in what you refer to as new film theory, if that's also part of a Cold War effort too? Like I would say that, you know, and certainly in the post-war period, sort of like on the one hand, a move away from history that could be used politically, like agitprop on the one hand, and then a move towards, let's say, kind of humanism and formalism that, you know, kind of explicitly turns its back on history, and that also takes up a metaphysical framework, which, you know, then it might just like think of in terms of liberal democracy, or et cetera, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if that's also like, one can historicize that, really. Really. But I think that your solution, certainly to this crisis and like bringing together film, your critique of new film theory, and as well looking at cinema and Weimar cinema in the context of philosophies of history. So I would say that the solution is that one should look to form to find our engagement with history, right? So the kind of new film theory looks at form, finds humanism. Yours is that we have to look at form and find various modalities of history, that allows us to kind of address the crisis directly. And it's this effort to engage closely with the modalities of cinematic form as historical critique that make this work invaluable to modernist studies, right? I think that being able to look to form and to not just locate the history, but to mobilize it as something that speaks to the crisis of history, right? Its limitations, what it cannot do, is actually really very useful for modernist studies, because there's a tendency to locate history through either kind of an unthought historicism, that is less through realism, but more through a focus on historical events per se. And again, a way in which one steps away, and another way, I think one of the ways that you're thinking that we should address history is very much along the lines of someone like Hayden White, right? To see, like, look at the modes of employment that we see in the structure and the form that address a particular crisis in historical. I'm particularly fond of the chapter on Caligari because expressionism is among the most anti-historicist methods. I love the phrase that you have, the world. That is, you were thinking about expressionism's engagement with Schopenhauer, and you write the kind of a new framework of Schopenhauer's the world as will and representation, but this is the world as will and representation of the madman. One thing I would like to ask you, maybe spark a conversation about, is that because you are so carefully focused on the, form as critique, if we could talk a little bit about failure, for example. I mean, one of the things that is really fascinating about Dr. Caligari is precisely because it takes up this very, ultimately very pessimistic form of historical thinking, which, expressionism is very deeply engaged with. It's like kind of a rejection of a kind of the value of the past, right? Or even this kind of attempt in that sense. You talk about this in terms of like the form, the kind of the flattening of the, of the set design. Caligari is very famous, circular and, also like kind of loopy and maddening, labyrinthine environment. But yet at the same time, this attempt you characterize as a failed attempt to escape the film's spatial realism. And so that cyclicality is, on the one hand, engaged in critique, but it also is a very, very explicit gesture to failure. I mean, and we can think of this as well as like how Spengler or someone like Oswald Spengler, who famously comes up with this cyclical notion of history, and the deep and profound fatalism that's part of this, right? Because it's all about a particular type of form, a structure, but a structure that is never, ever, bound to agency, right? It's sort of, it's an also, or as Donna would like famously, point out that, it's kind of a sickly, depiction of a form that has that, speaks to a history that has no subject behind it, right? So, so that's something I wouldn't mind talking to you about, is failure, right? And then lastly, how these structures and forms carry on to, or that critique actually that carries on to contemporary cinema, right? I mean, your final chapter on Metropolis, which you use to speak about history and analogy, right? And so there's something about, right, the very structure of, Metropolis, the kind of, the set design, which brings you into this, the world of the workers and the kind of tripartite, machine world. But that structure is something that becomes, like a formal analogy that can, and that is carried on to so many other films, right? Like you see this in Blade Runner, you see it in Parasite, as you really, bring out, and, other films. And so that reproducibility, I think, is something that I would want to speak to as well. So I'm going to stop because this is your book.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. First, let me thank Stephen and the Townsend Center for organizing and hosting this event. It's really great to be here among colleagues, students, friends, and mentors. And it's particularly meaningful that, well, like Donna, I'm a Berkeley alum. And so some of my former advisors are here today, including Marty J. and Tony Case. And I want to thank them so much for their support and guidance over the years. And I'm really grateful to Donna Jones for making time at this crazy point in the semester to engage with my work. I'm really delighted to be in conversation, especially given our common interests in German philosophy and theories of history. You gave me so much food for thought already. I can maybe speak briefly to some of the points you raised, and we can continue and open it up as well. Definitely, with regard to the question of the role of cinema and the types of films I'm looking at in the book, The book's argument is that Weimar cinema lent a kind of vivid expression to the crisis of historical thinking that was widely diagnosed by German philosophers in the early 20th century. And there have been many intellectual historical accounts of the crisis of historicism. They've mainly focused on intellectual debates rather than considering how this crisis of historical consciousness found more popular expression in the film and audiovisual culture of interwar Germany. So my book tries to kind of place Weimar cinema in sustained conversation with these philosophical critiques of historicism. And I mean, there were many intellectuals of the period who were already drawing those connections. Most famously, you could think of Siegfried Krakauer's essay on photography from 1927, where he actually integrates a critique of historicism into a theorization of photographic media. You can think also famously of Walter Benjamin's On the Concept of History from 1940, which also makes reference to photographic technologies and obviously a sustained critique of Rankian historicism of the 19th century. And what my book tries to do across a series of case studies is to look at some of the most legendary films of the Weimar Republic and to think about them as films that were taking up these broad-scale debates about the meaning and coherence of history. So you mentioned Caligari, which famously kind of rejects perspectival aesthetics and embraces expressionism, this distorted set design, and also has this radically ambiguous ending where if 19th century historicism presumed a certain alignment of power and ethics, Caligari makes it very unclear who is the madman, in fact? Is it the inmate at the insane asylum, or is it the director, in a way that I think radically calls into question institutional power and authority? Or we can think of Fritz Lang's Destiny from 1921, an episodic film that allegorizes death across different times and places in world history. And the film, I think, kind of rejects a historicist emphasis on treating every epoch on its own terms or as immediate to God. And instead, the film finds all sorts of kind of parallels and analogies between different world historical epochs and regimes. Or Hans Richter's Rhythm 21, which really rejects the referential or indexical quality of film and retreats into a total abstraction in a way that tries to achieve a temporality of pure presence. So those are just some of the examples of the ways in which these films were playing with form as a way of thinking through broader historical philosophical questions that were being widely debated in the 1920s. Maybe just two other points in response to the great commentary that you provided. One is, I mean, in terms of the broader interventions that the book is staging, one is indeed to challenge the so-called historical turn in cinema and media studies. So in the 1980s, around the same time as New Historicism in literary studies or Nouvelle Histoire in the Annales School in France, there was a kind of archival or historical turn in film and media studies where in place of screen or apparatus theory, which presumed a kind of universal monolithic spectator, there was a return to the archive in an effort to really historicize what we mean with terms like the spectator or the screen, technology, et cetera. And I guess my critique is that oftentimes this historical turn in cinema and media studies fell back on certain tenets of 19th century historicism, even though that tradition of German historicism entered a state of crisis at the very moment when cinema emerges at the turn of the 20th century. So I'm kind of arguing for a more reflexive model of historiography that thinks film together with this moment of crisis in the historicist tradition. And more generally, there's been an interest in the last 10 or 15 years in film philosophy. So how it is that film serves as a medium of thought. And this is often traced back to writings by people like Stanley Cavell or Gilles Deleuze of the 1970s and 80s that place cinema in the service of ontological and ethical examination. And what I try to do is to challenge the periodization of film and media philosophy by showing that already in early 20th century Germany, there was a kind of sustained conversation between film and philosophy, especially when we look to philosophy of history. And then finally, I think the question of failure is fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. Certainly, with Caligari, there is a direct link to Schopenhauer because the screenwriters of the film actually say that they envision Dr. Caligari to look like Schopenhauer. So there's a kind of direct philosophical engagement there. Just
Like the streaks in the hair.
yes. And Caligari, for many people, was a step in the wrong direction for film aesthetics. So for a lot of commentators, it moved film back in the direction of theater or painting rather than taking advantage of what was specific to the filmic medium. So for them, the film was an aesthetic failure, as you're saying. And there are kind of other directions where we could take this as well. I mean, one is that the film highlights the failure of the historicist tradition insofar as it has this radically ambiguous ending, where we're not sure how things actually transpired. We're not sure which account to believe. So there's a kind of rejection of the Rankian dream of showing how things actually were via eigenes Gewesenes. At the end of the film, we're left with two totally incommensurable accounts without any kind of standard of judgment with which to adjudicate their truth claims. So there's a kind of failure of the historicist tradition in making sense of the film. But more generally, there's been a shift in cinema and media studies, especially with media archaeology, to thinking about film and media history in terms of dead ends, losers, roads not taken, omissions, and failure has assumed a kind of interesting centrality there in terms of thinking about media technologies that didn't work, that were dysfunctional, or moments of failure as things that highlight the kind of workings or infrastructures of media that we oftentimes just take for granted. And so in certain ways, it anticipates the new project that I'm working on, which is actually on the concept of perfection in film and media theory, as oftentimes the opposite of failure. And what do we actually mean by perfection? How does it get defined against a term like failure? And we can maybe say more about that as well.
Yeah. No, because I thought that was really fascinating. Also, like what I realize in Caligari, it's a failure on two levels. Like or maybe, I might be wrong, but I always felt like there was a failure on the level of us not knowing, like what to believe. Like, and this is certainly not like, it doesn't describe things as it should be or would be. But it's also like a failure in terms of a depiction of inner life. Right? Like, because the whole point is like, it's supposed to be this kind of, psychoanalytic thing going on, right? You're in a madhouse, et cetera. And like, you're thinking about this in the context of like the dream world is supposed to like reveal something that is hidden or, but it's also a failure there, you just kind of, you're sort of you're left with this is a bad insane. This is literally an insane asylum. It's like where we contain the mad kind of thing. So yeah, I just it's just failures framed throughout it, and I found that quite fascinating, given like your argument on the crisis of historicism.
Definitely, and yeah, with Caligari, for those familiar with the film, it's a film that. Through its frame narrative, which is cyclical, so the kind of Spenglerian topos that you were mentioning before with this more morphological or cyclical vision of history, it's a film that really highlights the act of narration and in a way that pushes back again. So Leopold von Ranke famously said that his dream was to extinguish himself, so a kind of self-effacement of the historian and just those things as they actually were without any kind of hermeneutic mediation on the part of the historian. And Caligari really pushes back against that by saying, no, we always are hearing history from a certain perspective. And there's a way in which in that chapter, I'm interested in how the historicist tradition led always to this threat of relativism. And this is at the very same moment that Einstein's theory of relativity is also being popularized. It's confirmed in 1919, just a few months before the premiere of Caligari. And in my archival research, I find that many critics were actually drawing links between Einstein's theory of relativity and Caligari, not only in terms of the sense of relativity, but also this kind of topsy-turvy world where the usual coordinates of experience, space-time, causality, were somehow muddled or distorted. And then it's a film that, is rejecting, as you said, kind of perspectival tradition that had reigned since the Renaissance, and instead is interested in a kind of Nietzschean idea of perspectivism. So a kind of doctrine that, especially in Nietzsche's early writings, that there's no kind of God's eye view anymore on the workings of history. We're all looking at history from our own vantage point, and I think Caligari aligns itself much more with this kind of early Nietzschean idea that history is always comprised of individual finite perspectives rather than ever being able to give us a kind of omniscient God's eye view on the action, for sure.
Right.
Should we open it up for questions?
Yeah.
Great. So we have a good 25 minutes and we'd love to hear from everyone. I think there's a microphone coming to you.
Hello. I'm curious because there's a camp of critics who view Caligari as an aesthetic failure. Is that like a criticism that's levied to the whole like movement of Weimar cinema, or is it what examples of Weimar cinema would be aesthetic successes?
That's a great question, and thanks so much, David. It's my psychoanalysis class right now. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of debates about Caligari, both in the 1920s and beyond. And ironically, yeah, where critics were more critical of it in the German context, actually in France, it was very popular, and so it had a kind of large international legacy. There were many who thought that it betrayed the kind of fundamental properties of the medium of film and led film down the wrong path. So for them, it was a kind of failed experiment to reject the basic properties of the filmic medium. Others, though, embraced the film. I mean, certainly, we would have to look on a kind of case-by-case basis at the different films and how they were received by critics both in Germany and abroad. And then there are broader, of course, debates about Weimar cinema and, in terms of questions of failure. I mean, and we have Tony Case here who can say much more about this. But I mean, certainly for Krakauer then in 1947, when he's looking back at the entire corpus of Weimar cinema, he sees nothing but kind of premonitions of fascism, right? And it doesn't mean that Weimar cinema was a failure, but that we can actually use Weimar cinema to lend insight into how Hitler actually came to power, that it betrayed already kind of psychosocial tendencies that could lead in the direction of fascism. So there are certainly efforts to think about Weimar cinema as a full corpus. In my book, I look at a kind of series of case studies and think about how they're received in terms of especially how they're thinking about questions of historicism. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. I've read the introduction so far. I'm trying to get further as the semester comes to an end. I have a question about, well, you mentioned Krakauer's discussion of historicism in the photography essay, but he also takes film particularly as a medium of history, and not just of depicting history or discussing history, but as a medium that gives us concept for a theory of history or philosophy of history. And I'm wondering if this is something that you take up in the reverse, right? To what degree are the films that you analyze and discuss in the book themselves applications of theories of history? And to what degree are they generative of such a degree, right? What can we learn from these films about ways history was not just depicted, but really theorized in that time?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannes, for being here. So Krakauer is a key kind of guiding figure for my book because probably more than any other intellectual, he's someone who was enmeshed in both debates about cinema and participated in the theorization and historicization of film, but also was very involved in debates on the philosophy of history. And of course, his final book that he writes in American Exile and then is published posthumously in 1969 is History of the Last Things Before the Last, which is his kind of philosophy of history that makes a lot of references or comparisons then with film aesthetics to think about the historical process more generally. Krakauer is one of the key figures who then links the crisis of historicism with photographic media, including film. And so already in 1923, he writes for the Frankfurter Zeitung an article on the crisis of science, where he reviews actually Trolte's book on historicism and its problems, and alongside a book of essays by Max Weber on epistemology. So he's very aware of the kind of debates that are happening in the Weimar period about historicism. And then 4 years later, in the famous photography essay, he integrates that critique of historicism to then theorize photographic media, where if historicism tries to reconstruct the series of events or occurrences without any gaps, he famously mocks the kind of Goethe philologists who want to get the complete record. Photography tries to do that spatially by representing the kind of entirety of our world. And he thinks that film is this medium that brings together those two axes of experience, so space and time together, insofar as these are moving images. And he imagines, kind of a giant film that would show us this kind of perspectival, this multi-perspectival sense of the completeness of historical reality. So film becomes the kind of, on some level, the historicist medium par excellence. But then, of course, there's a dialectical twist at the end of the essay where he thinks that film also has the possibility for montage, something that obviously Caligari doesn't make that much use of on the aesthetic level, which might be another form of failure in terms of a kind of failure to explore the full aesthetic possibilities of the filmic medium.
Yeah.
But he thinks that that montage can help kind of re-scramble or reconstellate all of the photographs in a way that suggests the possibility of a different social order. So kind of messianically tinged Marxism then comes forth there. And I have a chapter of the book that took me forever to write because I was tracing basically all of Krakauer's writings from the early 1920s when he begins as a film critic for the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1921, all the way up to his final book, and looking for all the references to film and history, and especially the historical film genre, and seeing how his kind of thinking is evolving over the decades. And he has a kind of curious thesis that I think kind of scrambles or reconfigures the classic Aristotelian distinction between the historian and the poet, where for Aristotle, as you recall in the Poetics, the historian always shows what actually happened. So this kind of empirical reconstruction of the past, whereas the poet moves into the subjunctive mood of things that could have or might have happened. And for Krakauer, we get this kind of reconfiguration of the dichotomy where the poetics of film paradoxically lies in the medium's documentary potential as a historian of contemporary life. So there's a way in which those terms get kind of put through the loop with Krakauer, but he's very critical of the genre of the historical film because, and this is in chapter 2 of Theory of Film on History and Fantasy, and it's striking that he even pairs those two together, already suggesting a kind of challenge to Aristotelian aesthetics. But he says there that whenever films try to recreate the past, they try to lend us access to a world that's of course no longer present. And so in trying to show things as they actually happen, so the Ronchian Wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, they actually can only show us things as they might have or could have been. So they always turn poetic at the precisely the moment that they want to be historical. So there's a way in which Krakauer is thinking this through with regard to the inevitable kind of aestheticism of 19th century German historicism. And then in terms of some of the contemporary debates on film and media philosophy, there have been, it's a broad, relatively amorphous field with a lot of different schools, including analytic, cognitivist, neuroscientific, continental, et cetera. But there are certain distinctions, including one between what's called a kind of strong thesis versus a more modest thesis. So the strong thesis would be that films can actually create new ideas through means or devices that are specific to the filmic medium. So films can actually give us insights, you know, just like philosophers can, would be that stronger version of the argument. The more modest version would be that films can illustrate or visualize pre-existing ideas and in ways that aren't necessarily specific to the filmic medium. So that's been one of the kind of structuring dichotomies or distinctions that's you know, informed the field of film and media philosophy. For my own part, when I look kind of archivally to the 1920s and see all of the different ways in which film and philosophy were in conversation with one another, it's a very messy terrain where there are all sorts of different points of comparison there, whether it's like screenwriters and directors who were making references to philosophers like Schopenhauer, whether it's, you know, film critics who are drawing links between this film and, you know, this philosopher, or, you know, whether it's philosophers who are reflecting on their first experience seeing movies, particular screenings, or thinking that film has this kind of privileged status as a novel medium of thought. So archivally, I think some of the analytical distinctions start to break down when we look at the nexus of film and philosophy in the 1920s, if that starts to answer the question.
Congratulations on your book. I just have a follow-up question. You know, in From Caligari to Hitler from 1947, he really criticized Caligari looking back for its ending, as you know,
Yeah.
and it failed to kind of depict a critique of authoritarianism. And it's, I think, a little surprising because he seems to suggest that a kind of symptomatic reading is the one that is the most politically efficacious. That, you know, the narrative even in an allegorical sense, should play out some kind of politics. And I'm wondering how you kind of negotiate this, this idea that film simply reflects history or should kind of play out the roles that history, even as it's kind of unfolding, in contrast to, all these other ways in which Krakauer is really theorizing a much more sophisticated and complicated relationship between film and history. So, it's always striking to me that he really slams Caligari for this failure, the ending. So just wondering.
Yeah, thank you so much. Steve Cho is another Weimar film scholar. Thanks so much for coming. Yeah, for Krakauer, I mean, it's based in part on false information that he received from one of the screenwriters who said that that the ending was tacked on, that originally it ends, that there's no frame narrative in the film, and just the middle story is that we realize is basically that the head of the insane asylum is in fact the madman himself, and then claimed that then the frame narrative was tacked on afterwards as a way of diffusing the implied critique or challenge to institutional authority. And we know that that wasn't actually true. So there's a factual error in part that it's resting on, but also it's as a kind of hermeneutic, close reading of the film doesn't fully work either, because insofar as expressionism or expressionist aesthetics gets linked to the theme of madness or insanity in the film, you would expect then that the frame narrative would restore, quote unquote normal stylistic decor, which it doesn't. The expressionism continues into the frame narrative as well, in a way that I think also, so in a certain way, I think the ending is much more radically ambiguous than I guess Krakauer gave it credit for in that particular case. And these inverse, kind of mutually incompatible endings of the film, where you see on the one hand, at the end of the inner story, the head of the asylum being put in a straitjacket, and then at the end of the frame narrative, the narrator of the film being put in a straitjacket, I think implies actually that we don't really know either way, and that that's actually the critique of historicism, which is that we don't know how things actually were. There are two radically incompatible versions of the story, and we're left without any standard with which to adjudicate them, or any sense that that there is truth in history altogether. History is always just finite perspectives that were lent on the action, yeah, I think it's tricky in terms of the broader trajectory of Krakauer's career, for sure, how Caligari to Hitler fits in. And that book has taken a lot of criticism over the years for being overly reductionist, whether for being too monolithic and for being overly teleological. And certainly, I think in his later writings, especially the book on history, The Last Things Before the Last, there is a kind of tacit critique of some of the methodological premises of Caligari to Hitler, even if he doesn't mention it by name. And then there are also continuities, though, there as well, in part because in the 1920s, Krakauer is a kind of devoted Marxist by 1925 or so. And he wants to insist that a social order that's constantly naturalizing itself always relegates contingency to the margins. And so the task of photography at the end of the 1927 essay and of montage is to show that the current way things are isn't the way that they have to be. So to kind of restore contingency to a social order that always wants to naturalize itself. But by the time you get to the Cold War context of the mid-20th century, when Krakauer is in American exile, suddenly there's a kind of totalization of contingency where the entire historical universe is contingent, and the task of film, the aesthetics of film is based on this sense of contingency. And I mean, there's a political dimension to this as well, even if his relation to Marxism is attenuated, insofar as it's a kind of reaction against some of the big ideologies and doctrines of whether fascism or socialism that tried to insist on a kind of deterministic, law-like vision of history. There was something political about insisting on contingency and determinacy. And that's something that I think runs all the way from Caligari to Hitler to his final book as well. So that would be a point of continuity there as well.
Thank you for these productive statements. Just one clarification question, I suppose, about the methodological framework. I'm curious You've been making these suggestions about how a given film's narrative conceits are suggestive of or generate or help us generate certain inferences about the model of historicity that it presupposes. But I'm curious whether there is any threshold point for you between story and history, or if you think that the feedback loop between the two is actually seamless, and the way a certain narrative is structured, whether in a linear fashion or in a fragmentary fashion, is immediately recuperable on a higher level as its model of historicity.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks so much, and I hope I followed it fully. In certain ways, this brings us back to, yeah, the question of Aristotelian poetics from before, with this distinction between the historian and the poet. I think in certain ways, a lot happens in the 19th century that breaks down the distinction between history and the story, right? Because on the one hand, you have the advent of modern historical science with Leopold von Ranke as a kind of founding figure, which tries to lend the individuality of things a measure of significance equal to the universality. So there's a kind of restored dignity to the particular, the individual. At the same time, you get the advent, and you're the literary scholar, not me, but of realist literature, which focuses on concrete details, producing what Roland Barthes famously calls the reality effect. So in a way, there's a kind of breakdown of the usual distinction between history, literature. Someone like Droysen, obviously in the 19th century, writes about this as well. And history and literature become increasingly similar, both in their content and in their modes of description. And in a certain way, at least from the historiographical angle, the crisis of historicism was very much about this breakdown of a distinction between empirical reality and a kind of fictional construction, or about, yeah, in certain ways, what's true in German, das Wahre, and then what seems true, the verisimilar, das Wahrscheinliche, which, you know, works better in German than in English. But so I think it's very much about this collapsed distinction, for sure.
Hi, thank you so much for this book. I absolutely love it. And what I really appreciate is the way that you are brave enough to sort of sink down into close looks at a few films, you know, so really giving them their due. But I wanted to ask about two other films. One is the film that you most regret not being able to dedicate a chapter to. What would that be? And the other one is, what film from this period where there were so many films made, do you sort of worry about, because it troubles your theory most? Like which one is sort of a stumbling block to you?
Those are great questions. Thank you so much, Nazva, for being here, and you also help lay the foundations with your seminars. So I really appreciate that. There's both really great questions. I thought about whether to talk about Nazi cinema at the end, and I didn't wind up doing so, but there is a film, Der ewige Wald, The Eternal Forest, that I think is a kind of remarkable retelling of German history through the lens of the forest, that I think is experimenting with form in a way similar to Weimar cinema. And in an earlier iteration of the project, I thought about writing an epilogue on that, and then instead I moved in the direction of thinking about Metropolis in relation to two more contemporary works of global cinema, Sorry to Bother You and Parasite, that take up the kind of vertical imaginary of Metropolis in that regard. But it's a film that at some point later in life, I'd love to go back and write about. One of the things that haunted me in the project was what to do with the genre of the historical film. Obviously, a lot of literature on film and history goes immediately to the genre of the historical film, so films that try to recreate or reconstruct past periods or events and then reenact them with fictional and or real characters. And some of those films actually I found less philosophically interesting, and I wasn't sure how to write a whole chapter on them. So my kind of solution was then to write about them through the lens of Krakauer and to see why it is that Krakauer disliked them, basically, and his reasons for disliking them shift. I mean, he had a kind of consistent dislike for the historical film genre, but that was my way of kind of solving that dilemma of how to write about a set of films that were very popular in the Weimar period. So whether it's the kind of historical pageants of Ernst Lubitsch, like Madame du Barry, or the Love of Pharaoh, et cetera, or the films about Frederick the Great, the Frederikus Rex films that were enormously popular in the 1920s, but I didn't know if they could sustain a full chapter on their own. So using kind of Krakauer was my way of addressing them in the book, even without devoting a full chapter to them in the way that I was other things. And it was important to me also to kind of expand, to show Weimar cinema was a genre cinema, and it was important for me to pick films across a wide range of genres. So Caligari, obviously, as a kind of early horror, mystery film, Destiny as an early fantasy film, Rhythm 21 as a kind of key work of the avant-garde of the 1920s, Holy Mountain as a distinct kind of German genre of the mountain film, the Baer film, and then finally Metropolis as a kind of early science fiction film. So I wanted to run the whole gamut of genres, also as a way of kind of developing a loose typology of thinking about time and history through the moving image.
Nick, we've been discussing these issues for a very long time, but I always find something new to think about when I hear you discuss them. I want to push a little bit the question perspective and its implications. Ever since the early 18th century and Chaldenius, historians have understood that they have a perspectival, let's say, advantage over the actual actors in history. That is to say, they have hindsight. They see how the story comes out. They know how good intentions lead to bad ends and so forth. They also, however, are situated. They have a perspective from a particular place in time and a particular spatial place. They are in some sense grounded rather than above the fray. So, you can see this, for example, in the way Krakauer understands the German cinema. He is situated very clearly after and has his own agenda based on what happened in the interim. My question, though, concerns the, let's call it complexification, if I use that word, produced by the cinema and the issue of point of view in the cinema, the issue of the cinema eye, the issue of the fact that through the techniques of montage and other ways in which one gets a visual experience, which is perspectively perhaps fractured, perspectively multiple, let's call it polyvisual experience, there is a kind of enrichment, we might say, of the possibility of perspectivalism, which goes against the implication that the crisis of historicism people drew, which is that perspectivalism is inherently narrow, relativistic, partial, gives you only a fraction of a truth which is somehow unattainable. Whereas the cinema, because it has the capacity to multiply perspectives in the cinema eye, which is not the eye either of the participant in the film and the diegetic action of the film, or the actual eye of the person watching in the theater, but has its own logic, that this in a way creates a different dynamic, which moves us beyond perhaps the limits of Chaldenius' version of perspectivalist historiography.
Yeah, thank you so much also for your guidance and mentorship over the course of the project over the last decade or so. I really appreciate it. There's a lot to be said definitely about the question of perspective. And yeah, in the chapter on Caligari, I'm interested in the kind of convergence of two phenomena. On the one hand, in modernist aesthetics, the advent of something like post-perspectivalism, so rejection of the perspectival linear scheme that had reigned since the Renaissance and its association with Cartesianism. At the same time as in Nietzsche, you have the advent of a kind of philosophical idea of perspectivism, which is that you're always looking at history from a certain kind of vantage point, which is something that I think Caligari very much enacts. And certainly there is this question that Koselleck also writes about, that we're always part of the very historical process that we're trying to make sense of. So we're always players in the action. And there's there are two kind of guises that this assumes in 19th century historicism. On the one hand, there's the kind of Hegelian version of historicism, which tries to assume something like a God's eye view on the action, so this view from on high. And then there's the more modest, self-effacing version of someone like Leopold von Ranke, who thinks that there is a God, right? That there could be something like a God's eye view. It's just that for him, it would be unattainable. And so he's much more interested in the kind of modest, self-effacing task of reconstructing history to the best extent as he can. Certainly, cinema is kind of a medium that enacts a certain form of post-perspectival aesthetics through unique properties like camera movement, like montage, things that some of the films that I write about definitely explore. And I guess what interests me and what I think, in terms of Caligari's failure, to bring it back to that as well, is that Caligari in a certain way aligns itself with an early version of Nietzsche's interest in perspectivism, right? And so certainly, and James Conant has a two-essay kind of series about the dialectic of perspectivism in Nietzsche, where he says that between the early 1870s and the late 1880s, Nietzsche's kind of thoughts or his flirtation with perspectivism shifts from a kind of early sense that that there's no possibility for reconstructing historical truth to then a more mature idea that at least through the admixture and accumulation of perspectives, you could arrive at something closer to the truth. And this is an idea that Karl Mannheim writes about in his 1924 essay on historicism as well, that even if we're always looking at history from our own different vantage point, our own perspective, at least through the multiplication and admixture of all of our perspectives, we could arrive at something closer to the truth. And I think in a certain way, Caligari aligns itself more with the earlier iteration of Nietzsche than maybe the later one, if that starts answering.
Quick follow-up. What is your own perspective? In other words, have you, I mean, this is a blind spot that we all have. So it's one of those things that usually comes up in an embarrassing way when you're forced to answer the question I just put. But have you in any way been able to thematize or locate the place from which you were writing this book?
Yeah, so, and I had you in mind actually when I did this, but I know we talked about this question of reflexivity, right? And one of the things that I struggle with this project is how do you write an account of a crisis of historicism that's now part of our own history without adopting a historicist methodology? And so in certain ways, I wanted there to be gestures towards kind of reflexivity in the book, even on a formal level myself. And you had told me that a first book can't be that radically experimental, and I took your advice, but I do end the book with a kind of nod to James Joyce. And Finnegan's Wake, of course, famously ends mid-sentence with the word "the." And I didn't want to have the last word on Weimar cinema because it's endlessly rich. And right now, there are certain resonances of the Weimar period, but in 10 or 20 years, there might be other ones. And so I end the book with the word "the" as a kind of nod to James Joyce, and a way of also gesturing towards the kind of modernist experiments that I'm writing about in the book. And certainly to go back thinking of historical pessimism, the book also opens with Joyce as well, so it's also a kind of cyclical moment because I open the book with the famous line from Joyce's Ulysses from 1922, that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake, the Stephen Daedalus line, and of course, something that we all very much feel at the moment and in the past week as well, in terms of the kind of pessimistic view of history that we're all trying to awake from. Is that all we have time for?
I think so.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you.